That's awesome.
All right, we're going to start. Hello, welcome. I'm really excited for this panel and so glad to see you here. My name's Emily Broad-Lieb, and I direct the Food Law and Policy Clinic, which is part of the Center for Health Law and Policy Innovation at Harvard Law School. I see a lot of our CHOPE folks around. And I'm really excited that in collaboration with so many of you and so many organizations to host this panel on land loss, wealth, and reparations. So just to say a little bit about the groups that I'm involved with and why we're excited about this panel, and then I'm going to thank our co-sponsors and introduce our moderator. The Food Law and Policy Clinic is the first food systems dedicated clinic in the country. I'm happy to report, we have peer clinics, but it was really here at Harvard Law School that we developed this model of looking at issues around the food system, and this includes health, it includes environment, and it includes the people who produce food. Farmers and growers and farm workers and many of the people who have been dispossessed of the land that they used to grow on. So that's what we'll be talking about. And I'm also the faculty supervisor of the Mississippi Delta Project, which is one of our co-sponsors, and stem from work that I did right immediately after law school in the Mississippi Delta on a lot of issues, but a lot of them really working with small farmers, a lot of small black farmers who had to deal with a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about. So it's been something that has been near and dear to my heart, that we've worked, an issue that we care a lot about in the clinic and in our center and also in the Mississippi Delta Project. So I'm really excited that we were able to bring together this all-star panel. I'm going to give all the credit for that to Nate Rosenberg, who's our moderator and a visiting scholar with the Food Law and Policy Clinic, and I'll introduce him in a moment. But our panel is really, I think, the top people looking at and working at and thinking about these issues, and I'm really excited to hear from them about the problem, about solutions, and about what we can be doing in our own kind of communicating beyond this room, and then in our own work, in our program, and others that are here. I want to also thank our co-sponsors. There are a lot of them, but I think it helped us bring together this panel, so I'm going to name them briefly. So it's the Harvard Food Law Lab, the Food Law Society, the Mississippi Delta Project, the Harvard Law School Systemic Justice Project, Black Law Students Association, the Labor and Work Life Program, and then the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice, the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History, the Food, Water, and Agriculture Club at Harvard Business School, Harvard Center for Population and Demographic Studies, Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, and Fresh Food Generation, and the Island Foundation. So to say, this touches, I think, on something that's close to a lot of organizations here on campus and in the area, and I'm just excited that we were able to bring so many people together to talk about the topic. I want to take a minute to introduce our moderator, who's really fantastic, and I get to brag on him because he's an alum of our program. So Nate is a scholar whose work focuses on inequality, food systems, and the environment, and he's been working with a lot of the panelists on some of these issues, which is how he was able to really bring us the best folks to talk about these topics. He's taught as a visiting assistant professor at University of Arkansas School of Law, at University of Iowa College of Law, and at NYU's Food Studies program. And has worked as a consulting attorney for Earth Justice and as a legal fellow at the Natural Resources Defense Council. And he is not only an alum of the Food Law and Policy Clinic, but was the founder of our Food Law Society, which was also the first student-run food law society in the country here at Harvard Law School as a student. So he's been really, an incredible resource at the HLS community, and then also was a Mississippi Delta Fellow after me. Before I turn it over to Nate to introduce our amazing panel, just two notes. One is that we're recording this event, both because we have an overflow room in case lots of more people come, but also because there was so much interest from others in watching this. So if you don't want to be on the recording, make sure you're in the back, and I think when we do questions at the end, we'll put them on mic, so you might want to think about that. And then also we're going to have some appetizers out in the hallway after this so that people can stay and mingle for a little bit and have a little snack and get to talk to our panelists up close. So please join me in welcoming Nate to introduce our panel.
Thanks, Emily. And I want to thank Emily and the staff of CHOPE and the Food Law and Policy Clinic for making tonight possible and doing so much work to bring everyone here together. So each of the panelists, to give you an idea of what the run of tonight, each of the panelists will be speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we're going to have an audience Q&A after their presentations. And our first panelist is Bryce Wilson Stuckey, who is a statistician and writer who lives in Washington, D.C. He has published articles in The Nation, Prospect, Bicycle Times, and New Food Economy, and he likes to play guitar and fish. Our second panelist is Thomas Mitchell, a professor at Texas A&M University School of Law, where he also served as interim dean in 2017 and 18. At Texas A&M, he co-directs the program in real estate and community development law. Prior to joining Texas A&M in 2016, he served on the faculty of the University of Wisconsin School of Law for 16 years, where he held a chair in law. He is a national expert on property issues facing disadvantaged communities and has published leading scholarly works addressing these matters and others. Professor Mitchell has an extensive record of doing community engagement work, and to this end, he was one of the 10 national recipients of the Elizabeth Hurlock Beckman Award in 2013, based upon his work mentoring law students who then go on to do critically important work as lawyers in helping disadvantaged communities. Professor Mitchell is a graduate of Amherst College, the Howard University School of Law, and the University of Wisconsin Law School, where he received an LLM and served as a William H. Hastie Fellow. Our third panelist is Dania Francis, an assistant professor of economics and Afro-American studies at UMass Amherst. She received her doctorate from Duke University and also holds a master's degree from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree from Smith College. Her current research involves using experimental and quasi-experimental methods to identify causes of racial and socioeconomic academic achievement gaps. More broadly, Professor Francis's research interests include examining racial and socioeconomic disparities in education, wealth accumulation, and labor markets. She has been researching the issue of reparations for African Americans off and on for 17 years, and is a co-author of an influential paper titled The Economics of Reparations in the American Economic Review. Professor Francis is a board member of the National Economics Association and a National Academies of Education Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellow. And our fourth panelist is Darrick Hamilton, the executive director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. Professor Hamilton is a prolific and internationally recognized scholar and public intellectual whose work fuses social science and policy disciplines to examine the causes, consequences, and remedies of racial, gender, ethnic, and tribal inequality in education, economic, and health outcomes. Professor Hamilton is a graduate of Oberlin College, earned a PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina, and completed consecutive postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Michigan and Yale University. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Bryce Stuckey.
Okay, I'm going to be doing kind of an overview of our research so far. So I've been working with the rest of the team here on estimating the value of land lost by black farmland owners in the 20th century. And This research is still ongoing, but I'm going to be presenting kind of our lower bound estimate of the wealth lost by black families. Okay, so the wealth gap today, probably everybody knows it's very large. It's been persistent over time, and I'll be talking about the connection between kind of wealth and social and political status and power. Okay. So, black families, their low wealth is, they're relatively low wealth compared to whites as a product of history, past discrimination, which has kept them out of the political process. And then it's also a sign of their continued exclusion from the political and social life. And I think some of the things we're going to be talking about tonight will address ways that we can rectify these imbalances. Okay, so I'm going to start sort of with a history of land acquisition, and then I'll talk about the decline. So after the Civil War, almost all black families had no wealth. This is a graph of farm ownership over time. So it goes from just after the Civil War to 1910, and you can see that the ownership came actually very quickly. I think it was as high as 20% by 1880, and then it got up to about a quarter of families owning their farms by 1910. And by 1910, or around 1910, there were probably about 17 million acres or more in black-owned farms. And some of these pictures are of farms and farm owners, and you can see that, life wasn't exactly luxurious for the farm owners, but it was better than being a sharecropper or a tenant. They had more autonomy. They had more control over the crops that they planted. Their homes were a little nicer, things like that. Okay, and there was also another part of accumulation, wealth accumulation, was black families in cities, and that was also fairly rapid. Of course, we remember that they're starting from zero, but not as many black families were living in cities by 1910, so the main source of wealth was in farms at that time. Okay, and contemporary intellectuals and black intellectuals and regular people were very enthusiastic about land acquisition by black families. W.E.B. Du Bois kind of saw farmers as a hope, for black people. He saw them, I guess to him it was proof that, black families could be successful in wealth acquisition. So he made a big deal out of them. A lot of intellectuals did at the time. And regular people were also very preoccupied with trying to escape the peonage, the control of sharecropping and tenant farming. And they were successful at a higher rate than I think a lot of people know about. So, at this time, they didn't have a ton of wealth, but it seems like they had about, I said, 5% of Southern agricultural wealth when agriculture was the dominant industry in the economy. Compared to today, I've seen in 2013, black families were estimated to own about 2.5% of all national wealth. So this was a significant achievement that came pretty quickly. So you can kind of understand why people were optimistic at the time. But instead of continued accumulation, what happened to black families was that many of them started to lose their land. And so what's important to remember is that this time there was a lot of repression. The South was, ruled by a white supremacist political class, and they were not, thrilled about black landowners. So these are some pictures of some, white supremacist Southern politicians at the time. And I think all of these guys owned farmland or they came from farming families. Okay, so these white supremacist politicians, they made sure that black families, weren't getting much help from the government, and this was an important reason as to why they lost their land. Okay, so black families dealt with a huge amount of violence from their white neighbors. There's a study of lynching victims that found that communities with high rates of landowners were more likely to experience a lynching, and landowners were targeted when they stood out, like when they were in an area of low ownership. There's also been studies of towns where there was a lynching and the people in the community became scared and they left, and white families ended up taking control of their property. And I've even read about draft boards targeting black farm owners during the World Wars, but overlooking the sharecroppers so that they could keep them, as captive labor. Okay, so, black people were facing the political and legal discrimination and outright violence, and that did kind of slow down as the century went on. But by around the time of the New Deal, or during the New Deal, there was kind of a creation of the modern agricultural state, which kind of spelled the end for black farmers. So in the New Deal, the agricultural system shifted towards supporting large-scale commercial farmers, and because most black farmers had small farms, this wasn't good for them. And then another byproduct of the New Deal was a federated control of agricultural resources so that they were distributed at the county level, and powerful farmers and white supremacist leaders in these counties made sure that they controlled these committees, and that pretty much ensured that black farmers were not going to get this assistance. So from after the New Deal through the middle of the century, Southern farms mechanized. There was an enormous amount of consolidation, and this meant that many black farm owners lost their land, and the tenant families and sharecroppers who were never able to buy land were kind of expelled from farming, and many of them ended up migrating to the north as part of the Great Migration. Okay, so this graph kind of shows the consolidation in farms. It shows the number dropping and the acreage increasing. And then I have pictures of black families leaving the South for the North. Okay, so we have this backdrop of the government, tilting the playing field in favor of large farms, which put black farmers at a disadvantage, but they also faced intense racial discrimination. So moving on to the 60s and 70s, in the 60s, after Freedom Summer in 1964, there was a concerted effort to get black farmers onto some of these county committees, and they faced massive reprisal. This is in Pete Daniels' book, Dispossession. And so not only did their effort to kind of integrate these committees not succeed because of white resistance, they also the people who participated in these campaigns became targets. And black farmers were also kind of central in the civil rights movement because they owned property. They were able to shelter activists, because they had independence from the white community. And they were able to use their land to help with civil rights activity, and that made them a target. So this is from our research. You can see the decline in acreage, and it kind of plateaued actually in the mid-century, but after kind of when things started getting fully mechanized in the 50s, and then when there was kind of this backlash in the 60s and onward, you can see that the acreage took a serious nosedive. So a huge part of the problem of black land loss is institutionalized racism at the USDA. So, for many decades, USDA agents have discriminated against black farmers. Sometimes that's kind of outright denial of loans. Other times it's more subtle, like giving a farmer a loan late. And when they get a loan late, they can't plant as early, the harvest is not as good, they can't repay the loan, they go into debt, they have to, give some of their land over to USDA, that kind of thing. And this has been a huge source of dispossession for black farmers. Black landowners have also been subject to various kinds of financial and legal coercion, which Thomas will talk about more. These pictures are from an AP series that's really great about some of the ways in which black families lost their land. And I recently learned, if you read this series, you'll see that there's, I think, about a dozen stories of black families across the 20th century. But I talked with a professor who helped with this, and he told me he put out an advertisement asking for stories from black families who lost their land, and he got hundreds of responses. So, we would like to incorporate those records into our research as well, but we're still looking into that. Okay, so these problems have not gone away. The violence is not there in the same way as it was at the start of the 20th century, but the discrimination absolutely is. Nate and I published an article earlier this year about systemic discrimination at USDA. We've got a picture of of a farmer and then a landowner who've been discriminated against, or whose families have been discriminated against, and then the last Secretary of Agriculture and his civil rights director. And, a huge problem is that the bureaucracy in Washington is not interested in solving this problem. Both of these guys have been very active in trying to get USDA to reform, and the department has been completely resistant. And some of the more subtle methods I was talking about before are, I think, more the norm of what happens today. Okay, so we wanted to try to quantify this loss of land. So I went through that section in an effort to convince you that black families in general did not sell this land at a fair price. So one of our assumptions in this preliminary research is they were not compensated for their lost land. We've also framed this as just a shifting of resources from black to white hands and being agnostic on this point, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that they were coerced often into giving up this land. So our main source of data was the Census of Agriculture, and this is the best comprehensive source of farmland ownership in the 20th century, although it does have a lot of problems that we've tried to correct for. Okay, so part of what makes this slightly different from some other papers that try to calculate lost value is that this farmland was a productive asset. The land itself is not only valuable, but the income that a farmer can get from the land is also very valuable. So most of the papers we've looked at find I guess they call it like a combined return of over 10% for most of the 20th century for farmland, and part of that is the return to the value of land, and the other part is profit from the land. So it's usually about 5% the land value, 5% the income from the land. And we've varied that, and it doesn't affect the estimate too much. Okay. So we've estimated that this lost land and income is worth 250 to 350 billion today. And this is a very conservative estimate, and I'll go into that in a moment. But this is, also not a tiny sum, and it's about the size of Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and American Express combined, and would increase average black wealth by 10%. So some of the things that we haven't captured yet, but we want to try, are the other benefits of landowning, like political benefits. I sort of talked earlier about farmers being important in the civil rights movement, but land also allows people, more control over their own lives. So there's been studies on black landowners, and it's found that they are able to invest more in their children's education, they're more involved in politics and civic life, and they have more control over their labor, which allows them to capture more income from their work. So we're going to try to incorporate some of those factors in later analysis. So, we are also going to talk tonight about how to make some of this right. So part of the problem we've talked about were kind of crimes committed against black farmers who are still alive today. And, presumably those things can be addressed, hopefully through the legal system. But then we've also talked about more the macro picture of the political economy being tilted against black farmers. And I think that deserves redress as well. So I think if we really want to change things in agriculture, we have to change the distribution of land. Black people own almost no farmland today. And things are so unequal insofar as land being so concentrated in the hands of the wealthy that this is a problem that is not going to solve itself, especially because black farmers face so much discrimination from the government. And that is the end of my talk.
So good evening. So I first want to thank all those who sponsored or co-sponsored this event. It's a very impressive list. I didn't find out till this morning that there were so many co-sponsors. I was thinking that there was one sponsor, there'd be about 20 people here tonight. Thanks for that. I want to specifically thank Harvard's Food Law and Policy Clinic and Emily and Emma for their great work in general in putting this event together. I want to specifically thank Nate for doing really yeoman's work and pulling together the panel. And then just want to say it's an honor to be on the panel with Bryce, Dania, and Darrick. Thank you. So what I'm going to give is a bit of an overview. Some of it you've gotten so far on black land ownership, some of the legal and extra-legal reasons that we've had such a steep decline in that ownership over time. I hope to talk a little bit about a case study that comes from this first picture, and I'll tell you about that in a second. And then I want to specifically focus on one type of ownership that's prevalent among low-income, low-wealth property owners of every race and ethnicity, but property owners who are disproportionately African American. The reasons why they own property in this very kind of highly unstable, dysfunctional ownership structure. But then I want to leave you with a tiny bit of hope, at least just a tiny bit of some positive developments in terms of certain legal reform initiatives, some policy initiatives at the federal level that are a bit of hope, but are at best a kind of a first start, right? So something that perhaps we can build upon. And I'll tell you why in a second. I have the slides are a little one slide's out of order, so let me kind of just go to that and try to distract you while we go to that. Sorry. See. Okay, I didn't mean to be that distracting. Okay, so, all right, so let me just then talk to you about that. Okay, this one. All right, so as Bryce indicated, obviously, during slavery, hardly any black people owned any land. But despite the federal government's reneging on its promise of distributing land broadly and widely after the end of the Civil War, the 40 acres and a mule promise, as it is popularly known, most people are then surprised to find out that African Americans actually did acquire, through heroic means, between 16 and 19 or 15 and 19 million acres of land between the end of the Civil War and 1920. By 1969, at least in terms of as measured by the agricultural census, which actually doesn't fully capture all of the land for African Americans own in terms of agricultural land ownership, you see that it was down to 6 million acres. And the most recent agricultural census shows that a little more than 32,000 African American owners and operators of farm operations own about 2.4 million acres of land. The last bullet point notes that, and this is a methodological issue. So I see tons of newspaper articles that talk about the demise, maybe the impending extinction of black farmland ownership. Sometimes it's conflated with black land ownership overall. And it cites the agricultural census. So just methodologically, the agricultural census, when it's reporting on agricultural land owned by farmers, is reporting on land owned by people who are active owners and operators of a farm operation. Okay, so why is that important for African Americans? There are many African Americans who own agricultural land, with the caveat there's been this huge and dramatic decline, as Bryce referred to. But there are many African American families who own agricultural land that is either lying fallow or they're renting their land to a white farmer who's operating the farm operation. If it's in those latter two categories, the agricultural census does not capture that. So there's kind of a delta where there is some additional agricultural land ownership. Unfortunately, the USDA only on a couple of occasions has done what they call a follow-on study to the agricultural census it does every 5 years to try to capture the more complete amount of black agricultural land ownership, or agricultural land ownership overall, including black agricultural land ownership. Last time they did this was in 1999, and at that time this agricultural census was showing about 2 million acres of black farmland ownership, once again by owner-operators, but this follow-on study called the ALO study estimated that there were 7.6 million acres worth $4.4 billion. Unfortunately, since 1999, the USDA has not done another such study that would give us a better picture of the amount, at least of black agricultural land ownership. But I often see in the media folks use the agricultural census number and conflate it with overall black land ownership, and African Americans do own some land in this country that's not agricultural land, and they conflate it with just agricultural land as opposed to agricultural land where there's an owner-operator. Okay, so let me okay, so what I'm going to focus on today is a type of ownership that is commonly referred to in many disadvantaged communities as heirs property ownership, and I'll get to why we call it heirs property ownership. When I was in law school, there was no textbook that said anything about heirs, and once again, it's not heir, it's not, we'll talk about, it's not the heir. There was no property textbook when I was in law school, which was a few decades ago, that mentioned anything about heirs property ownership. The formal legal name of this ownership is tenancy in common ownership, which is the most prevalent type of what we call common real property ownership in the United States. As heirs property is commonly understood, it's property that results when people don't make a will or an estate plan, and so that's how it's commonly understood. And so one thing to note, if you were consulting with a business planner, an estate planner, someone who had expertise in entity formation, no lawyer in their right mind would recommend that you own property as a family or as any group under the tenancy in common ownership under what we call the default rules, the rules that the state will give you if you don't do planning on your own. So as So the heirs property or tenancy in common ownership is widely considered to be the most unstable form of common real property ownership in the United States. And it very much differs from when people come together and they make their own decisions and plans and rules about what will govern their common real property ownership. So whether that's something we call a limited liability company, some type of trust, some type of what we call a tenancy in common agreement, where you contract around some of the worst features of a tenancy in common ownership under the default rules. Those forms tend to assure that there will be much greater continuity of ownership at time. They allocate rights and responsibilities much more fairly than you do under a tenancy in common under the default rules. And they provide logical and rational rules for how someone can exit the common ownership structure. All right, so in terms of heirs property ownership, there's a lot of problems with it. I'm going to feature what I think of as the top 3 problems. So it's, as I indicated, it's the most unstable form of common real property ownership, largely but not exclusively due to a law called partition law. It's a property law. And the partition law is the law that governs how one can exit a common ownership structure when the common owners can't come to an agreement among themselves about the terms of exit. Second, the heirs property tends to be property because of the lack of wills and estate planning that over the course of multiple generations becomes highly fractionated. So what do I mean when I talk about tenancy in common ownership or heirs property ownership? You have to think about this ownership. So let's say there's 10 family members who own this. No single member owns, let's say it's 100 acres, any distinct part of the land. It's what we call undivided or fractional ownership. Think of it as owning shares in a corporation. So you have a 10% undivided share in this property. You can use the entire property, but if the property is sold, you're entitled to 10% of the proceeds. You're supposed to pay 10% of the property taxes and other what we call carrying charges. And as the property becomes highly fragmented over time, it often can paralyze the ownership. It can cause problems in terms of who's paying the property taxes. How does somebody who's paying more get reimbursed for paying more than their share? And it can cause problems in terms of trying to change the rules so that the property is operated in a much more logical, rational, and fair way. And the third problem is something we call a problem of lacking clear title. And if you lack clear title to your property, there are many problems that flow from that. These were highlighted after Hurricane Katrina. So after Hurricane Katrina, many families in Louisiana, Mississippi, were technically eligible to apply for some federal funds that were distributed through the states to rebuild their homes, repair their homes, have their homes bought out. But one of the prerequisites was that these families had to have clear title to their property. And there's a whole panoply of state and federal governmental programs for you to qualify, and this includes loans, commodity support, disaster relief. You need clear title. So who are these owners? They tend to be, as I indicated, low to moderate income property owners who are not legally sophisticated. They tend to be what we call land rich but cash poor. These, as I indicated, they're disproportionately African Americans, although other racial and ethnic groups also own what we call heirs property ownership. So one of the things with heirs property ownership, part of the reason it's disproportionately owned by African Americans, is that there's a huge and massive racial will-making and estate planning gap in the United States. So we see that there's this overall race. So intestacy means you don't have a will. So when you look at intestacy rates by race, and this is comparing white Americans and black Americans, they're very much, for every single racial and ethnic group, they're correlated with the educational level within that group. So in every group, those who have the least education, those without a high school degree, have the lowest levels of will making and estate planning, and correspondingly the highest degrees of intestacy. And those with the most education have the greatest incidence of making wills and estate plans. So that's true with every group, but when you compare the black-white will making or intestacy rates, they're fairly shocking, I think. So we have this overall gap that only 36% of white Americans don't have a will, whereas 76% of African Americans don't have a will. But then when you look at them by educational levels, so you note that the lowest level of will making is among white Americans without a high school degree. And so, I'm sorry, this was actually the rate of, so anyway, so 43% of white Americans without a high school degree do not have a will. But then you compare it to African Americans, right? So within the African American, the highest rate of will making is African Americans with a college degree or a college degree and a professional degree, like a law degree or a graduate degree. And so that's the highest rate of will making among African Americans, but still, that only 32% of African Americans with a college degree or a college degree and some additional degree make a will. So it's a massive gap. Part of the reason we have that gap, there's been various hypotheses, and some of the hypotheses are that after the end of the Civil War, African Americans, as a practical matter, had no access to legal services. Most of this land was in these rural southern counties where white attorneys mostly did not want to represent African Americans, and those who did oftentimes took advantage of the African American clients that they had, which then instilled a lot of distrust within the African American community of the legal system. In terms of some of the issues in terms of or causes of black property loss, there's been the extra-legal violence and intimidation. There has been loss just in terms of voluntary transactions. But in terms of involuntary legal mechanisms, there's foreclosure, tax sales, eminent domain, partition sales, which I'll talk about, and adverse possession. Okay, so technically, like if you look at the legal ones, yeah, technically if you went to a registry of deeds and saw, well, how was this property transferred involuntarily from the black property owners to someone else, you'll find one of these. But what's important to note is that oftentimes this wasn't the cause. What the cause was discrimination that rendered these property owners incredibly vulnerable, as Bryce indicated. Decades of institutionalized racism within the USDA, denying people loans that they should have qualified if they approving them at the end of the planting season. So what did this do? This crippled them financially and rendered them very vulnerable to, for example, foreclosures. So foreclosures would be the thing you would see, but behind that you have to understand that there are these other kind of precipitating causes. Okay, so I'm going to just transfer just a little bit to the hopeful part, is that working with a number of community-based public interest and legal aid organizations, I don't know, about 20 years ago, I started working to kind of address some of the abuses with heirs property ownership, the unstable part, this law of partition. So under the law of partition, just a primer for some of the law students or lawyers in the room, education for others. It's why a tenancy in common under the default rules is incredibly unstable. Is it you can have just one of the common owners can decide to go into court, irrespective of the size of their fractional interest. They can own a 10% interest, a 5% interest, a 1% interest, a 1/1000th interest, a 1/1,000,000th interest, and they have the right to go into court, file what we call a partition action, and request the court to order a forced sale of the entire property, even if everybody else wants to maintain ownership. The courts have routinely ordered such sales in those circumstances with somebody who had a tiny interest, filed that action, petitioned the court for the forced sale, and the sales often produce, almost always produce a below market price and often a fire sales price. So the working with others, I was appointed the principal drafter of when I talk to lay people, I say a model state statute. It's technically called a Uniform Act. It's promulgated by the organization in the United States that's had the longest history in drafting model state statutes, called the Uniform Law Commission. Usually when I talk to law faculty and I mention this, they glaze over, and then I mention to the lawyers, have you ever heard of the Uniform Commercial Code? And then like a bright light goes on, and I said, well, where did that come from? Was that manna from heaven? No, the Uniform Law Commission, together with another organization, ALI, drafted the UCC and 400 and some odd other uniform acts. So this is one of their acts. It's called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. It has a variety of features that tries to make a partition process much more equitable, to enhance the private property rights of families who want to maintain ownership, or at least to protect their real estate wealth. And I'm not going to get kind of wonky here about the particular features that seek, but trust me, I hope, that the procedures do increase the ability of families to maintain ownership and to increase their real estate wealth. When I began working on this in the late 90s, essentially folks had told me that I was completely wasting my time, that there would never be any legal reform at the state level to respond to the needs of poor African Americans who lacked political capital and lacked economic capital. So I basically was kind of told, just give up, like don't bother, and you might not make tenure if you pursue this legal reform. Well, I don't know, 20 years later, what do we have? We now have, I don't know if this is going to come up, we have 13 states, and the United States Virgin Islands have enacted the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act into law. The New York legislature passed it this summer. We're just waiting for Governor Cuomo to sign it. And we are expecting that we, in the next several months, will have 7 to 10 other states introduce it for consideration in their legislatures. We've already gotten commitments from Florida, Virginia. It was recently filed a week ago or 2 weeks ago in Massachusetts, and I spent the afternoon with the representative who introduced it. We were strategizing about it. And let me get out of this. Okay. And South Carolina was one particularly notable state that passed it, and yes, that's then Governor Nikki Haley. All right, so let me just lastly talk. Okay, so I've mentioned some of the problems of clear title. One of the things that also has happened is under the federal farm bill that was signed into law in December 2018, it tried to make certain USDA programs more accessible to disadvantaged heirs property owners, obviously including many African Americans. So the USDA had a rule or a policy that if you were going to apply for loans, commodity support, disaster relief, you needed clear title to your property, meaning that there was a very well-established legal document that demonstrated who all the owners were. Oftentimes these families don't have that. It hasn't been conclusively determined who is the set of common owners. And so effectively many heirs property owners, including many African American heirs property owners, were locked out of many USDA programs, thereby inhibiting their ability to build wealth. All right, so the Farm Bill contains some provisions that will make it easier, theoretically, for these heirs property owners to be eligible to apply to these programs. Okay, but this is the USDA, I must say. So there was a lot of hope when the federal farm bill passed. The USDA still has not implemented or developed regulations for those provisions, so they are not yet bearing fruit, but we hope they will. Okay, so let me just, there's this last problem in terms of heirs property ownership. Essentially, people get locked into it because the rules say that if what's happened is, with a lot of media attention in the last few years, heirs property owners have found out about how unstable this ownership is, and they didn't know it because the legal rules are totally counterintuitive. Some of the families then said, okay, I got the message, we want to change the form of ownership. And then they find out that there's another problem. And so it's what I call the gridlock problem. So the law in this area requires, they say, yeah, you can change your form of ownership, or if you're going to do something else substantial with the property, yeah, you can do that. But it requires 100% agreement among all the common owners. Well, when you have an ownership structure where it's not uncommon to have 20, 30, 40, 50 owners, you could have a problem just locating that distant cousin. You could have a holdout. I mean, I don't know about your families, but in my family, we mostly get along, though we don't always get along. I'm sure your families are different. And so it just takes one person. And so oftentimes these families, I was in South Carolina a few months ago, and these families, they feel like, okay, they got the message. They've learned about the legal rules, and now they want to change it, and they find out now they can't. As a result of the success of the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, the Uniform Law Commission approached me in the last month, and they asked me, they said, Thomas, do you have any ideas for like an heirs property 2.0 version? I said, well, that's funny, I actually do. And so we are potentially going to have a second Uniform Act, and essentially what the proposal is, instead of requiring 100% agreement among the tenants' commons to do something substantial, we'll lower it to something like 2/3, thereby enabling people to have property where it's much more flexible, how they can respond to certain crises. All right, the last thing I will say, and I better stop talking because you got the really esteemed folks coming up, I'm just kind of the warm-up act, is so this picture, there was some commonalities between a picture of Bryce showed. So Bryce, you showed that one of your pictures, there was an activist you mentioned who's been for years trying to get the USDA to operate in a discrimination-free environment. And the picture you had is a guy, Gary Grant, who is in Tillery, North Carolina, which is in Halifax County. Gary is from, there's a New Deal history. So in the New Deal, there was this limited attempt to provide poor farm families who had mostly been sharecroppers, who had not been landowners, with the opportunity to acquire a farm on good terms. They had to pay for it, but it was under a mortgage, under low interest rates. There were 100 such communities of these farmers. They were called resettlement communities, and they had the farms, but then they also would have a school, healthcare facilities, and some other types of infrastructure. 9 or 10 of them were actually black resettlement communities, but the one in Tillery, which is where Gary's from, and his parents were one of the first settler families. Tillery is known as being one of the 2 largest. Well, in some of the research I was doing, I actually discovered that Tillery is not an all-black community. Tillery was part of a project that actually had a black section and a white section, and it was called the Roanoke Farms Resettlement Community. And let me just, in like 3 minutes, just give you some salient facts to kind of then show you how discrimination gets layered and layered and layered to the disadvantage of black farmers and black landowners. So you have this New Deal program it was seen as progressive within the USDA at the time, even though the USDA was predominantly concerned about large landowners during the New Deal. So this was a kind of politically contentious section of the USDA. The idea was that these families would be means tested. So I actually thought when I started the study that, this is great. It's like a natural experiment. Like, equally poor white sharecroppers given an opportunity to own land, and it did hew to Jim Crow norms. So the white and black sections were separated by 10 miles, but about 100 families on the white section, 100 families on the black section. Well, just let me tell you a couple things that happened. Right before they were going to move the families onto the property, they switched the sections at the last second. They switched them because the soil sample came in. The soil sample demonstrated that the land where they were going to put the black families, 100% of that land supported tobacco. Tobacco is the highest cash crop. Almost none of the properties on the land that they were going to settle the white families supported tobacco. And so they switched, and they gave the black families the lower valued property. They give them the lower valued property, but I've seen all 200 deeds, and they tell you the acres, and they tell you the sales price, so you can do a price per acre. It turns out that the black families paid 30% more per acre to get the worst property. Third, you had a supervisor who was who was in charge of these projects. The one here would shuttle back and forth between the black and white section. And it is very well documented that he did everything within his power to drive the black families out of farming. And he used his discretion to stymie their farm operations. Next, it turns out that formerly the USDA had a policy, or this was called the Farm Security Administration or Resettlement Administration, had a policy that the families had to spend 100% of their time working their farms because they were supposed to be successful. It turns out this farm manager, there was a defense contractor plant within half an hour. He allowed many of the white families to earn off-farm income to supplement their farm income, but denied the black families the ability to do so. So when you kind of fast forward over time, the black properties are worth, a small fraction, the remaining ones. There's been a lot of loss because those farmers were vulnerable. A lot of them lost their land because of USDA discrimination, but the remaining amount of property owned by blacks is valued a lot less. Their infrastructure looks shabby and it's shuttered up, whereas the white families, when they first moved, this is the last thing I'll say, they were actually stigmatized in Halifax County as these poor white trash. Well, what happened over generations, because of the assistance of the government, is that they were able to build wealth. They took all these New Deal farming homes on the resettlement were about 1,000 square feet. The white section today is indistinguishable from the properties around it because the families have improved, they've expanded, and so you see, because of that governmental intervention, there was this affirmative action, this assistance for the white resettlement families, such that that stigma of participating in a quote-unquote government program has been erased. And there's been a narrative created that these were hardworking farmers who had the right values. There's a counter-narrative at Tillery that if you talk to people in the community, they're like, yeah, well, these black farmers, they're always complaining, but is it really our fault that they were given land for free by the federal government? Not true. And they squandered their agricultural loans, literally somebody told me this, on $1,000 suits and Cadillacs. And so you see that gets normalized. And we have these very racist explanations for something that is totally ahistorical. All right, so thank you guys for letting me take a few.
Thank you. I'm over here taking notes. Jot down. Okay. Let's see. Okay, excellent. So first, thank you all for being here tonight. It's a pleasure and an honor to be invited here and to take part in this esteemed panel. And thank you again to the event organizers and the sponsors. I feel it's important to say, because it's on video, that I neglected to update my bio. I'm at UMass Boston. That is my home affiliation. And much of what I'll say today is drawn from a manuscript that I've been preparing for the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. So I'd like to acknowledge them and also encourage you to visit their webpage at equitablegrowth.org. However, all of my opinions are my own. Please don't fault them. Okay, so the idea of reparations for African Americans has received renewed attention, driven in part by the willingness of an unprecedented number of prominent politicians to engage in a serious discussion on the topic. So I'll start by discussing a brief history of the movements for reparation in this country. Near the close of the Civil War, on January 16, 1865, General William T. Sherman signed Special Field Orders Number 15, which temporarily allotted each formerly enslaved family living along the Atlantic coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida no more than 40 acres of land on which to settle and make a living. President Andrew Johnson later reversed these orders and returned the land to white Southerners. Many descendants of formerly enslaved persons point to these 40 acres and a mule as an unfulfilled promise by the U.S. government and a basis for the earliest calls for reparations for slavery. Since that time, there have been multiple judicial, legislative, and grassroots efforts advocating for reparations for African Americans for slavery. In the judicial arena, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist by training, so I'll just preface it with that. In the judicial arena, there have been many lawsuits filed in the United States and in the United Kingdom against financiers, insurers, and shipping companies who profited from slavery. In 2002, Deidre Farmer-Pillman coordinated lawsuits against the U.S. insurer Aetna, Fleet Boston, Financial, and other corporations for their role in the slave trade. These cases were ultimately dismissed for lack of standing, exceeding the statute of limitations, and for being deemed a political matter outside the scope of the judiciary. Legislatively, Representative John Conyers has introduced H.R. 40, a bill to establish, quote, commission to study reparation proposals for African Americans, unquote. So not for reparations, just to study. Right? In every Congress since 1989 until his resignation in 2017. The bill had never made it out of committee. This year, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee reintroduced the bill, and prominent 2020 Democratic presidential candidates have endorsed it. Increased support for the current bill may be due in part to an increase in grassroots efforts in support of reparations. Grassroots efforts promoting reparations for African Americans have come in waves. At the turn of the 20th century, Callie House, a poor washerwoman who was born into slavery, lobbied Congress to provide old age pensions for the formerly enslaved who were no longer physically able to work to support themselves. Okay. And for her efforts, Callie House was dubiously imprisoned for fraud by the U.S. Postal Service, which claimed that her organization, the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association, big name, was collecting dues from Black people knowing they would never receive government payments, the government payments for which she was lobbying. So they claimed, this is never going to happen, right? That it was so ludicrous that she would even have this thought that it would happen, that to collect dues for that purpose is fraudulent, right? And this is, if you want to know more about Callie House's story, there's a wonderful book, My Face is Black is True, by Mary Frances Berry. And for those with long commutes, it is available as an audiobook. Okay. Organizations such as the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women, founded by Queen Mother Moore in the 1950s, and the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, NCOBRA, founded in the late 1980s, have advocated for reparations for decades. Okay. More recently, Ta-Nehisi Coates' influential article, The Case for Reparations, published in The Atlantic in 2014, along with Nicole Hannah-Jones's New York Times 1619 project, has revived popular interest in reparations and helped broaden the discussion of the basis for reparations to include the Jim Crow era of state-sanctioned discrimination, the discriminatory federal, state, and local laws, policies, and ordinance prevalent during the New Deal and post-World War II eras, and ongoing institutional racism in employment, education, and the criminal justice system. And so I put here this redlining map of good old Boston from 1938 to remind us and to connect a dot directly from the dispossession of land in the South, right, through the Great Migration, right, to northern and western cities where ownership of homes was again challenged by state-sanctioned policies, right? The Homeowners Loan Corporation, a government entity, was drawing these maps in which the sort of defining characteristic that made an area red, meaning not able to be loaned to, was that there were Black residents there, right? Okay. So now I'll turn to the logistics of carrying out a reparations program, right? So by definition, reparations involve the making of amends to those who have been wronged, whether through money or by other means. Key logistical questions that arise when conceptualizing reparations for African Americans include who should be eligible, how much money should be allocated, how should it be financed, and what form should reparations take. Okay, so today I'm just going to focus, given my time, on two of the questions, how much and what form. All right. So how much? Research teams currently working on refining reparations estimates, are currently working on refining reparations estimates, but estimates have been calculated in the past, mostly in the 1990s and the 2000s. This was during sort of another wave of interest in the topic of reparations. And those estimates range from 500 billion to 6 trillion. Dividing this amount evenly amongst the roughly 40 million people identified as Black or African American in the 2020 census, again a very rough estimate, yields estimates of 12,500 to 150,000 per person. And this very wide range arises from differences in both the calculation methods and in the underlying rationale for reparations, right? Whether it should just include slavery, whether it should also include the period of Jim Crow and the New Deal era, whether it should incorporate ongoing discrimination. So different estimates arise at different values because of these reasons. So for example, prominent reparations researcher William Darrick Jr. at Duke University took the value of 40 acres of land in 1865, the aforementioned unfulfilled promise at the end of the Civil War, multiplied that value by 4 million formerly enslaved persons, and calculated the present value compounded yearly at 6% interest to arrive at $1.3 trillion in 2008, in 2008 dollars. This is kind of a estimate that was done around 2008. Dr. Darrick has a forthcoming sort of tome on reparations from here to eternity, from here to equality, where I'm sure he's updated some of that. University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign economist Larry Neal calculated the difference between the wage that an enslaved person would have received if paid for work and the amount spent by enslavers on food and shelter for the enslaved from 1620 to 1840, and compounded that value yearly at 5% to arrive at an estimate of $4 trillion. All right, so I give these examples to say that this is part of something that should be studied, right? I wish we had a bill that said something about that. We don't know. So the idea is you have to think about what would go into it. We definitely have sophisticated means to arrive at estimates once decisions are made as to what should go into those estimates, okay? Estimates that include discrimination during the Jim Crow, New Deal, and post-World War II eras are necessarily larger. For example, referencing the Black land loss estimates Bryce told us about earlier, including estimated losses to the countless Black farmers who fell victim to violent dispossession of their land prior to the civil rights reforms of 1960s, as well as those who lost land due to discriminatory federal farm credit policies and the discriminatory implementation of federal, state, and local agricultural policies before, during, and after the civil rights era, would increase the estimate by hundreds of billions of dollars. Okay? So, what form? A reparations program can take many forms, including cash payments, investment in social programs, trust funds, an official apology, institutional reform, and public education about slavery and racial discrimination. Representative James Clyburn of South Carolina has argued against reparations taking the form of cash payments on the grounds that it would be logistically difficult to carry out. Instead, he and many other policymakers support investing in impoverished communities as a form of reparations. critics of reparations programs that focus on broad-based social programs, however, argue that they cannot be considered reparations if they do not specifically and solely target African Americans. Some may be opposed to cash reparations payments under the misguided assumption that African Americans cannot be trusted to spend cash payments in ways that will benefit them economically. While this assumption is unsubstantiated and potentially rooted in racial bias and paternalism, researchers have demonstrated that policymakers should be cautious about cash payments for another reason. It's possible that cash reparations payments could further impoverish Black Americans relative to non-Black Americans if there are no available vehicles to invest that money back into Black communities, okay? So for example, given that Black Americans own less than 10% of all small businesses in the US and hold less than 15% of their wealth in business investments, cash reparations payments in the current environment would most likely find their way back into the pockets of non-Black Americans, both through consumption spending and through investments held in mainstream financial institutions. That potentially further widens the racial wealth divide. This, however, does not have to be an argument against cash reparations payments, but rather an acknowledgement that any cash reparations payment should be coupled with the development of an investment infrastructure that could provide opportunities for recipients to invest in Black communities and Black-owned businesses and to create Black-owned financial institutions. Ultimately, the form a reparations program should take depends on the underlying goals. If the goal is to address the wealth gap created by discriminatory government actions like redlining and Jim Crow, cash payments or trust funds for investment in housing, education, or businesses may be the most appropriate form. If the goal is to repair or make whole those who were disadvantaged by the legacy of slavery and discrimination, an official apology, a program of public education about slavery and discrimination, and investment in social programs targeted at reducing racial disparities may be the most effective forms. If the goal is to address ongoing discrimination against African Americans, institutional reform may be in order. So again, this is something that should be studied. These are policy levers and goals to be decided upon. As a final note, I'd like to address ongoing discrimination in this country. Even if policymakers do not incorporate the damages from ongoing discrimination into the calculation of a reparations program for African Americans, no reparations program will be complete without somehow addressing the existence of that ongoing discrimination. As long as institutional discrimination persists, there will be continued grounds for future reparations claims. As an example, As an example, my co-panelists, Nate Rosenberg and Bryce Stuckey, penned an article in the New Food Economy where they identified ongoing discrimination at the USDA against Black farmers that has contributed to unjust foreclosures. Among other findings, one thing that stood out to me was that they report that the department, under the administration of George W. Bush, sat on civil rights complaints that alleged lending discrimination until the statutes of limitations on those complaints ran out. Then, officials in the Obama administration did not seek extensions from Congress on those statute of limitations. Instead, they actively foreclosed on Black farmers who had pending lending discrimination complaints, right? So even if the descendants of Black farmers were made whole for the loss of Black agricultural land during the Jim Crow era, future generations would have claims for reparations based on the documented ongoing discrimination by the USDA. To guard against this particular instance, right, this is a very small, low-hanging fruit that I'm about to mention, Congress should enact legislation that prevents any arm of government that's accused of discrimination from failing to act on the discrimination complaints until the statutes of limitations run out, right? That's low-hanging fruit. That's something we can maybe all kind of so there are certainly other instances of government agencies using loopholes to get around civil rights protections meant to guard against ongoing discrimination. Any reparations program should establish a commission to examine structural discrimination within federal, state, and local government and propose institutional reforms that reinforce civil rights protections to guard against the need for future redress. Thank you. That's all I have.
All right, so I'm going to buck the trend and not have a PowerPoint. I'm also going to try to go fast so that we can have, I bet there's lots of questions you all may have. My presentation is going to complement Dania's or be redundant to some extent. But, you know, at the outset, I'd like to point out that these injustices that we're pointing out are examples of state complicit or state facilitated acts. We often think of discrimination as being something of bigotry amongst white people or the private sector in general, and you know that's true. However, what we're talking about also is the state's role in these acts, especially when people start talking about, well, I didn't do it. You participate. We all participate in a country where we're responsible for what the state does. What else do I want to say? You know, I also want to point out that a lot of what we're talking about is not just slavery either, that it's ongoing acts of policies that might not have been specifically race-based, but by both design and implementation, they were not explicitly race-based, but by design and implementation, they were de facto or implicitly race-based. So I'm going to begin with the domain of education. Historian Ira Katz-Nelson, in his aptly titled seminal book that used the phrase that Thomas used, when affirmative action was white, documents that by 1950, the GI Bill alone generated more spending on higher education than the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe. The GI Bill and several other New Deal and post-war policies are successful examples in which the federal government invested heavily in the greatest growth of an American middle class. However, as I mentioned, by both design and implementation, in the case of education, black students and black institutions like HBCUs were largely frozen out of those benefits. The outright refusal of many white colleges to admit black students, coupled with the constraints on the growth of HBCUs and a far narrow access to federal subsidies, all products of public policy, drastically reduced the capacity of black Americans and black institutions to build wealth and secure college education. So these policies that we are talking about, that we might talk about today in terms of reparations or an economic bill of rights, they're not new nor are they radical. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his 1944 State of the Union address, he called for an economic bill of rights. He called for, quote, physical security, economic security, social security, and moral security as the first article of a second Bill of Rights included the right to guaranteed employment. So all this contrasts in what we might describe our political economy as a neoliberal free market, one that was revolutionary, which, you know, when we talk about some of the ideas being proposed by the Democratic candidates as radical, I think the free market revolution was radical, especially in its approach. It frames poverty and inequality as deficiencies internal to poor and blacks themselves. Stigmatization based on race and anti-blackness, they're strategically used as political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control on the underclass. Blacks become the symbolism by which we define a surplus population that's characterized as persistently unemployed and unemployable, a source of urban crime and malice, and whose subsistence needs are deemed a drain on fiscal budgets. In the neoliberal approach, the market is situated as the great, efficient, self-regulating, colorblind arbiter of our worth, and it's also considered the solution for all our problems whether they're economic or otherwise. The most astute, the most valued, the hardest workers, we believe them to prosper and endure, while the least astute, the laziest, in other words, the unvirtuous, the undeserving, those caricaturized as welfare queens and deadbeat dads, they're presumed to receive their just rewards and simply fade away or have to find something else to do over time. The presumptions pay very little attention to the roles of power and initial endowment and how that power and capital can be used to adjust the rules and structure of transaction and markets to privilege that power and capital in the first place. Power and capital are self-reinforcing, and without government intervention, they do what they do best. They iterate, and they generate cycles of stratification and inequality. Without capital, inequality is locked in. We use words like choice, freedom to describe the benefits of the market, but choice becomes an illusion for an individual that lacks basic needs like a job, adequate income, shelter, food, or health care. It is literally wealth that gives us choice, that gives us freedom, that gives us optionality. And then if we think about wealth disparity in our country and the racial wealth gap, it is dramatic and it's persistent. The typical black family has about $17,600 in median wealth, and that's inclusive of home equity, and that's nearly $150,000 less than the $171,000 median wealth of a white family. And what's more, if we look at the mean wealth disparity, the typical white family has $933,000 in median wealth, which is about in mean wealth, which is about $800,000 more than the $138,000 figure for mean black family wealth. But what we know is that the typical white family is not a millionaire. The top 10% of American households hold nearly 80% of the nation's wealth, or more specifically, and I'm sure you heard Senator Sanders say this a lot, the top 0.1% of earners, those earning over $1.5 million, own as much of the nation's wealth as the entire bottom 90%. Moreover, the bottom 50% of earners in America own about 1% of the nation's wealth. So this obscene concentration and its accompanying plutocracy, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Great Depression, it's driven by a class of white billionaires. Nonetheless, the racial wealth gap is equally as obscene, and it itself is an implicit measure of our nation's racist past. Black and brown households have little to no wealth, and their economic experience is vastly different than that of an extremely more fortunate and privileged typical white household. Wealthier families with financial advantages buy crucial additional advantages for themselves and their children, such as the ability to obtain an elite college degree without accruing costly educational debt. Lack of wealth prevents many families from accessing this advantage, contributing to an ever-increasing distance between those born with resources versus those born without. The way that wealth is generated in America, it is wealth that begets more wealth. It is critical to note that it was never the case that a white asset-based middle class simply emerged. Rather, it was government policy, to a large extent, literally government giveaways, that provided whites with the finance, education, land, and infrastructure to accumulate and pass down wealth. In contrast, blacks were largely excluded from these policies that created the wealth-generating benefits, and when blacks were able to accumulate land or enterprise, as my colleagues have pointed out, it was often stolen, destroyed, or seized by a government complicit theft, fraud, and terror. Our unjust racial wealth gap is rooted in a history in which whites have been privileged by government policy, political and economic interventions that have afforded them resources and iterative and intergenerational accumulation, in contrast to a history of exploitation and extrapolation of resources, as well as personhood of black people, again, by government complicit, and I like to point that out, government complicit fraud, theft, and violence. To achieve racial justice, We need an honest and sobering confession of our historical sins for slavery, a point in American history in which blacks were literally capital assets for a white landowning plantation class, and for sharecropping, for white capping, for Jim Crow, and the exclusion of blacks from the New Deal and post-war policies that built an asset-based white middle class. And for what my colleagues are pointing out, the Department of Agriculture's unjust implementation of policy. This authentic analysis would counter the neoliberal frame that caricaturized black and brown people as welfare queens, deadbeat dads, and undeserving, and instead paved the way for narratives that more accurately frame inequality as grounded in resource deprivation. The first component of a reparations program would be a well-documented acknowledgement and account of this history. It is a necessary, but it's not a sufficient ingredient to achieve racial justice. Acknowledging state-sanctioned terror against black bodies, the seizure of black wealth, and the widespread exclusion of blacks from government policy that promoted wealth and social mobility, it is critical for the American psyche. It would lead to a spillover effect, as I mentioned before, that would also benefit white poor people. We niggerize poverty. We use terms that we characterize black people as being lazy, undeserving. We characterize the white poor in those terms as well. So one of the positive spillover benefits of reparations would be an honest discourse so that we rethink the way we explain poverty in America. The second phase, we need to note that acknowledgement and apology alone, that would be empty if not accompanied by some form of material redress. There are multiple ways that Dania pointed out in which reparations could be paid. Some have talked about a Marshall Plan for black institutions in America, like, for example, seeding HBCUs with grants. We could come up with housing authorities to think about land reform. There's a potential moral hazard with that, though, where we see through gentrification sometimes policies aimed at neighborhoods and institutions don't necessarily accrue to the intended recipients. We should also think about direct cash advance. So like Dania, I agree that there should be some at least symbolic overture of redress without conditions. But also like Dania, I agree that, well, I'm not sure if Dania agrees with this part, but reparations should include some ownership of land as well as the means of production and the transfer. The racial wealth gap, as I mentioned, is in itself an implicit measure of our racist past. The past began with blacks serving as capital, and the system it evolved, et cetera. But so as a result of this system, blacks as a group have very little ownership in America's land or means of production. Without ownership, the stimulus that would come about from a reparations program could generate greater economic gains, mainly for the owners of that land and means of production. The ripple effect associated with a multiplier from reparations could lead to growing inequality, not because blacks would be dysfunctional in the way they spend their money, because they don't own the means of production or land in the first place, and that could be the biggest recipient from the benefit of a multiplier effect. Some people make the joke about, well, it's not even a joke, they were serious, about black people wasting their resources on a Cadillac. For me, the problem isn't that black people might have a taste for Cadillac, and I don't even know if that's true, but the problem is they don't own stock in Cadillac, right? That's the issue. All right, so let me try to wind down so we can get to, all right, so I'm gonna move on. All right, so let me say that in addition to a reparations program, we need an economic bill of rights in order to ensure a prospective approach to target especially the domain like wealth, like seeding every American with an account at birth or some capital at birth to prospectively address the racial wealth gap. We also know that our concentration of wealth in America, as well as its plutocracy, because with wealth it comes with political power as well, we need to break up that undemocratic concentration at the top. So we need, in addition to reparations, we need prospective policies to address wealth, not just for blacks, but whites and anybody with low resources going forward. And we also need some redistributive wealth or estate tax to address our plutocracy. So the political question is, how do we achieve these ideals? I think we need a sustained politics that's not narrowly constrained by what seems feasible, where feasibility is defined by the politics of here and now or our immediate past, which has been dominated by economic consolidation and plutocracy. To fully understand that free market revolution and how a status quo in America has been able to exist, where we had iterative concentration and political power at the top, we would have to embrace a third pillar in this relationship, and that is race, or more broadly, the existence of a permitted underclass marked by a subaltern identity by which dominant identity group members are able to be willing to sacrifice their vertical positioning in exchange for their horizontal positioning. In other words, as America becomes more unequal, the privilege of whiteness becomes more popular. At least if I don't have control of my vertical positioning, I'll be willing to invest in my horizontal positioning and not be black or not be Latinx, which brings to itself some benefits. And we can look at this as, our long inequality that's existed in America is not without tension. There are lessons from the 2016 presidential election, which represents at least a partial rebellion to the status quo. The election caught pundits and political scientists off guard. However, if we were to view that election from the lens of critical race theory, it would be less surprising. When Donald Trump, when he used his divisive appeal to whiteness, he said loud and clear and boisterous, "Let's make America great again," a gesture toward the fictional time in which white dominance was unquestioned and unchallenged. But his other not so subtle dog whistle broadcast that's not referenced as much is when he said, I'm your last chance, right? He said, I am your last chance. That was a clear overture to the pending demographic in which whites are expected to no longer be a numerical majority. All that was about codifying the property rights in whiteness. The fact that black families live in families where the head graduated from college typically have less wealth than white families where the head dropped out of high school. The fact that black expectant mothers are more likely to have an infant death than a white expectant mother who dropped out of high school. And the fact that a black man with a college degree is 3 times more likely to die from a stroke than a white man who dropped out of high school. The fact that blacks are generally the first fired and the last hired in a recession, those are all examples of property rights in whiteness. We know that 2 things are unambiguous from racial stratification. First, black workers are made worse off, and second, the capitalist class, which is overwhelmingly white, is made better off. What becomes ambiguous is the economic positioning of a white working class. And why is it ambiguous? Because white privilege offers both psychological and material benefits. An authentic racial coalition to address this paradigm of growing inequality, it would necessitate that the white dominant class give up the benefits of white privilege. But this privilege is based on an amoral notion of benefit. It's a benefit that's largely predicated on self-interested, neoliberal, and tribal norms in which accumulation knows no bounds. I'm going to present some good news too. The good news is that change may be happening. When we look at social movements like Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and the recent youth-inspired climate strike demanding the end of the use of fossil fuels, they're all examples of how younger generations and social movements are beginning to redefine economic good to incorporate principles like morality, sustainability, and humanity. These values are necessary ingredients if we're ever going to have an authentic coalition across race, across gender, across sexual orientation to address our common paradigm of growing inequality. We need a bold, transformative, race and gender conscious economic Bill of Rights. We need to recognize that there are a set of enabling goods and services that are so critical for individual life, liberty, and self-determination that their quantity, their quality, and access to these goods should not be vulnerable to the pricing and rationing that comes about from firms trying to meet profit-maximizing fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. We need policies where the government directly competes or crowds out inferior private options, those options that do not ensure universal and quality health care, housing, schooling, financial services, capital, and the free mobility throughout society without the psychological and physical threat of detention or bodily harm at the hands of a state-sanctioned terror because someone's social identity is linked to a vulnerable or stigmatized group. So in closing, reject the empirically unsubstantiated rhetoric that ignorance and so-called grit and personal responsibility reject that those are sources of inequality, along with the accompanying neoliberal paternalism in which government attempts to coerce or incentivize insinuated defective people to behave accordingly and make better decisions. Instead, change the paradigm. Let's be bold. Let's work at federal, local, state levels. Let's go into progressive and conservative communities. Let's advocate for programs and initiatives that truly empower people with economic security, dignity, and agency. And let's acknowledge and redress our state complicit and facilitated racist past. And then maybe we move beyond the nation's original sin of slavery, along with those accompanying narratives that situates disparity and poverty as deficiencies internal to blacks and the poor themselves. And let's do this with a long-term vision, not caught up in the myopic neoliberal scarcity frame, which at the outset constrains us from reimagining the society that we all might want and deserve. Thank you. I got one.
Okay, so I'm going to go straight to audience questions because we have such a big audience here and we're running low on time. But please, so we have some mics for you. Please speak in the mics because as we mentioned earlier, this is being recorded, and if you don't speak into the mic, we're not going to be able to hear. The recording won't catch what you're saying. And please keep your questions to 30 seconds or less. Okay, so any questions?
Maybe take multiple questions.
Hello. Okay. Hi there. Thank you for your presentations. Something that's been on my mind, which is very aligned with what you're talking about, is institutional racism. And for me, a thing that I've been looking at mostly is the food system. So the fact that mainly communities of color don't have access to high quality food, and as a result, there are a lot of health outcomes and just other issues related to that. So I'm just curious your thoughts on how do you resolve that type of issue where communities of color don't have financial resources to access high quality food, nor do they have geographical access to high quality food because it's often food deserts and just lack of good food. So is that a function of changing the way that we think about agriculture and black families owning land and then producing their own food, or are there other solutions that you guys have kind of looked at or evaluated as it relates to this issue?
You want me to go? All right. You know, I imagine that this problem could be addressed in multiple ways, from multiple angles. I'm just going to mention a couple of things about framing. You know, I think in general, thinking about, again, a set of essential goods that people need to thrive, so a right to food, I think that, especially in the legal community, that maybe that's a good framing point. But another good framing point is calling it food sovereignty. So having agency and self-determination with regards to food, I think is another good framing, because one way we deal with poverty and subsistence is we offer what we think is some minimum good, and then we try to come up with policies that try to sanction behaviors to, like a soda tax. So, you do going back to the Bloomberg administration in New York, we were going to tax sugary drinks at such a high rate so as to make it unaffordable to address that seemingly bad behavior. When right next to it is a healthy drink that costs a lot more than even the sugary drink with the tax, right? So to me, that's not approaching the problem from a food sovereignty standpoint, but from, again, a deficit standpoint. So I think starting with the framing of the issue would be important.
Yes, all I would add is that, in my work, I try to have a little bit of humility. So what I say is, what I'm trying to do is help that small group of black property owners who remain, to help them maintain ownership of their property. But that doesn't do anything about the folks who already unjustly lost their property. And that has nothing to do with any folks who never were given the opportunity to become property owners in the first instance. So I think just looking at it through a property frame, we would want to try to increase the ability of African Americans to produce food, right, both with those who own land today. But if you look at in terms of urban farmers, there's oftentimes, land use laws that restrict the ability of people to produce food in an urban context. So we'd have to reimagine what the property regime would be, as opposed to valuing property or thinking about the most important aspect of property ownership is the right to exclude. We might want to think about properties that are otherwise unproductive and vacant and adjust the property rules to allow folks to use that property for a higher social use to the benefit of their communities and others.
Okay, so please raise your hand if you have a question.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming. I have a question about the role that cannabis plays in all of this. I mean, at the end of the day, it is an agricultural product. As it becomes decriminalized and further legalized in the US, we will probably have a domestic production, and thinking about the ways in which it has affected communities of color. This seems like the perfect place to sort of tie in ideas of reparations and farming equity and access to land. Just curious about your thoughts on that. One, from a policy perspective, what recommendations can we as lawyers and advocates push for and advocate for so that the Black and the Latinx community can benefit from things that we have bore the cost for? And secondly, how do we think about this in terms of our larger struggle for reparations and justice?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I have a thought of that, just thinking about how that's playing out here in the state of Massachusetts, right? I think that people thoughtfully attempted to include some form of restorative justice into the legislation in this state, that as far as ownership and who can get permits to operate a legal cannabis distribution center. And I think what we've seen is that I think there's been like one potential license, not even fully yet granted under this restorative justice program. And part of that is because in structuring the baseline for how you have to apply for and follow all of the procedures for getting this, right? One of the things that it required was capital and to get a place, right? And to get a place, then you have to, if you're not buying the place, you have to, prove to whoever you're trying to rent the place from that, right, you're legit and this is going to happen. Well, you can't prove that unless you get the permit, right? So what happens is that it set up a situation where those who already had access to ready capital were much more able to follow this process, right? That's a problem. That's a problem with how the law was conceived, and that's a problem that can be looked at and addressed, right? By smarter minds than me. Again, I'm not a lawyer. But that's just the one thing I would say in thinking about how we structure even maybe well-meaning social justice-oriented restorative justice policies.
I mean, I even think in this case it's not even well-meaning. I think it's pernicious and obvious that, and you had mass incarceration of people based on something, and now you're using it in your favor to create another billionaire class. And I think the three ingredients that are critical in thinking about this consolidation is also not new. I think this becomes an example of something that has been going on, which is, as Dania pointed out, you need capital to get into this business, that's economic power, and you need a set of licensing, which is political power. So the state becomes a kingmaker in deciding, choosing who the winners and losers are. And then the third ingredient that I'm trying to infuse into the conversation is the role that race plays. So race gives you the political cover by which you can do something so pernicious. That it's no coincidence that race is clearly involved in this scenario, and we can be so transgressant against those that have been incarcerated and now a new billionaire class that has come about because of the marginal stigmatization associated with blackness. I'll say one other thing is, thinking about it in the context of reparations, I think it kind of fits, but I have a fear in terms of narrative and talking about reparations that we don't conflate contemporary justice-oriented policies with reparations, because it has the potential to dilute or, I'll use a bad word, bastardize reparations. I've been a big proponent of baby bonds, and so many journalists have tried to get me to say that this is a form of reparations. Like they try so hard. I had one conversation with a journalist about this where I knew that's where they were going, and I gave them the opposite narrative and explained so much why it's not reparations. So then the headline became, "Baby bonds, the closest thing we can get to reparations." I was like, damn it.
Cool. Thank you all for coming. Really, really interesting. I just wanted to go or see if you had any more ideas to go a little bit deeper on the idea of land distribution or redistribution without knowing a full, scope of history in these projects globally. I think that's a pretty fraught idea, but one that's also really, really important in this specific area. And I wonder how that plan would avoid some of the same pitfalls that a cash distribution program would, in the sense of returning that money to, in this case, like white property owners.
I mean, we got precedent, Homestead Act. I mean, we have a long history in America where we literally gave people land. But we in terms of means of production, why couldn't the U.S. government buy back stocks and redistribute them? I think we've been so caught up in giveaways and language that we forget our history. That is what we've done in the past, so we can literally do it, I think.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think that Dania talked in her presentation was, in terms of, in reparations, ensuring that there was a business infrastructure in place so that money wouldn't just cycle out of the black community and lead to disproportionately, maybe an unintended consequence of increasing kind of disparities, right? But I also think then we need to think about legal structures in place. So one of the things I think about is that under, and this is in federal Indian law policy, you know, we've had a dark history in this country of how we've treated the indigenous people in this country. We took away most of their land. Under the Dawes Act, we took away, you know, millions of acres from tribes, but then gave families the opportunity to own land in private property and individual ownership, not in terms of a certain collective ownership, right? And that was supposed to civilize these indigenous people in this country, right? As if they weren't civilized beforehand, right? But 80–90% of that land was then involuntarily taken from those families within a generation. And partially because obviously there was discrimination, but also because there wasn't a legal infrastructure in place to secure that ownership, right? And so when I think about some of this reparations, you know, whether it's in the form of cash payments, whether it's in the form of land redistribution, we certainly wouldn't want African Americans to own this property in what is well known to be the most dysfunctional, unstable form of ownership, right? That shouldn't be considered a black form of ownership. That is a substandard, suboptimal, dysfunctional form of ownership, right? So we should think about, when I showed that data on the massive racial will-making and estate planning gap, a lot of that comes from a massive lack of access to legal services. So we should be thinking about what are the other components that we would need such that those type of reparations would be sustainable in an intergenerational way over time, right? So some of that, you know, it could be these structures that we currently mentioned, like I said, you know, for land, just for an example of, you know, there's other entity choices, LLCs, trusts, what have you. But we could also think about alternative ownership structures, like community land trusts, right? Where you are the folks who own an interest in a community land trust, right? When they sell, they're not entitled to get the highest amount of appreciation of that property because you're trying to make that property sustainable among a certain community over many generations, right? So we might want to think outside of the box and not limit ourselves to the little toolbox that is well accepted, and we can think about the norms that make those well accepted, right? So.
I agree. I just underscore that, and I think that right there are a lot of positive people who want to make a positive impact in this world who know a lot about these things, right? And who are, you know, the technocrats and who have this detailed knowledge. And I think that, you know, one of the points that I was trying to make that I think Thomas just made really well was that, you know, whether cash payments, whether land, whether stocks, any of it has to be accompanied with some sort of scaffolding that can help reduce the structural discrimination that would lead to the loss of these assets. And that's not to be confused with the notion that there would be sort of behavioral deficiencies in Black people that would lead them to lose this, right? So being clear about that the scaffolding is not to say, you don't know how to do this, so we need to teach you necessarily, but rather how do we protect against predatory policies.
So we have time for just a couple more questions, but I wanted to remind everyone when we're done with the Q&A, there's appetizers out back in the hallway, so please take some food when this is done. Okay, so please raise your hand.
Thank you very much for all that clarity. I work on farming issues, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the Pigford case and how you looked at the consolidated case in reference to reparation, or whether that served primarily a contemporary justice function.
So I'll take a first stab at it. I don't want to be the only one necessarily, but so I do see it as a form of reparations. I'll have to think about that a little bit more, right? But very limited, right? So that in the Pigford case, this wasn't going back to USDA or the Federal Department of Agriculture going back to decades. It was very time limited. It was 1980 to, right? So it was a very discrete period of time, right? That took no cognizance of the decades and decades and decades of systematic discrimination that preceded that cutoff date, right? Second, though the Pigford case, it's stated, represents the largest civil rights settlement in United States history, even that is incomplete. So disproportionately, there was, I don't get too technical here, there was track A and track B in Pigford. So the idea was that if you had difficulty proving the full amount of your damages, you could apply under track A for what was a $50,000 payment. But oftentimes people couldn't prove the track B, the more expansive, because of government discrimination, of destruction of records. So there was a huge percentage of the claims that could not be brought because of the USDA discrimination. In addition to that, the farmers who still had active farm operations were declined at a higher percentage rate. So the folks who actually had the ability to maybe generate wealth were not, those folks were not compensated at a level. It was the folks who mostly had already been driven out of farming. So that's just another example where it was woefully incomplete. And third, the government in Pigford, and this is there are many more examples, but what most of the black farmers, or a significant or substantial or majority of them, wanted was their land back. Pigford, in terms of the remedies, said you can't get the land itself back. And when you start thinking about the estimates that are going to be made about the land itself, that swamped a $50,000 payment. I was in North Carolina when Pigford first got settled, when the 60 Minutes and the New York Times and the Washington Post were lauding it as finally reparations. And there was a black farmer who had lost their property who said, $50,000, seriously? That can't even buy me a used tractor. You forced me off of my 200 acres of land, my successful farming operations, and you're seriously going to give me $50,000. So I don't want to say Pigford's nothing. It was the largest civil rights, but I think it's at best an incomplete. And worse, and going to the points Dania and Darrick talked about, was there was little forward-looking prospective relief to ensure that the USDA would never engage in this behavior again. No one in the USDA got fired or lost their job who had committed discrimination, or if they did, it was except for Shirley, right? So anyway, so my point was, it's a very diluted, attenuated. I wouldn't want Pigford to be the model, but I also don't want to say it was nothing.
And I just have two quick thoughts to add. One, that in terms of reparations, right, there was no apology and no admitting wrongdoing, right? So that in and of itself, to me, disqualifies it from being thought of as reparations. And then to underscore the point that Thomas just made, that discrimination continued, right? We have the excellent reporting of Nate and Bryce, right? Discrimination in the USDA continued. And so without addressing ongoing discrimination or an apology, I think it's suboptimal.
Yes, so I just want to echo a lot of what Thomas said, and I might not be totally coherent because I'm kind of tired, but we had a section in our story about Pigford, and so the first thing I want to say about Pigford is these people were actually had crimes committed against them. So it's not, when you have a crime committed against you, you should have a redress for that. And Pigford didn't do that. We've talked to a lot of farmers who are involved in Pigford, and the biggest thing, in addition to the land, they wanted their debt relieved. And farming, requires a lot of debt because of the seasonal nature of it. And like, Thomas also mentioned, the equipment is very expensive. So some of these farmers had enormous amounts of debt, and really the only way, they had to do track A, which was more difficult to get that debt relieved, and so few of them prevailed. So we heard many farmers say independently, farmers who don't know each other say, like, I can't even buy tires for my tractor with $50,000, so it's nothing. And I mean, I think some of the other downsides of Pigford are a lot of, these black farmers' white neighbors did perceive this as reparations. And they also, so they thought this was unfair, that it wasn't given for a crime that was committed against, these farmers. They thought it was a handout, because that's the way the New York Times portrayed it, and every conservative outlet portrayed it. So in that way, it made things worse, for some of these farmers. And then another way it made things worse is people on Capitol Hill, the politicians on Capitol Hill, many of them think the problem was solved by Pigford, and it wasn't. I mean, nothing, it's just such a trivial amount of money when you compare it to like the estimate we came up with. A couple $1 billion is nothing. Final thing that was the theme in our article was that Tom Vilsack, who was the Secretary of Agriculture under Barack Obama, and his Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Joe Leonard, would hide behind Pigford constantly when we were interviewing them, because they helped come up with the settlement, the second settlement in Pigford. Well, they said they did. It's quite, it's kind of questionable how much of a role they really played, but so these are the same people who were discriminating against black farmers, including trying to foreclose on farmers with Pigford cases, saying that they solved everything because of Pigford. So I think that the media really did a horrible job covering Pigford, and it didn't really solve the problem, and it left a lot of people worse off than they were before. And then, because I'm slow, I also want to say one thing about land reform. Questioning that it has failed, I don't think it's a binary thing necessarily. Like, just to take the example in Tillery, where Nate and I went down there too for the article, because Gary Grant is a very effective activist, and we spent the day with him down there, and he told us about how there's a community of black sharecroppers nearby, who did not get land, and that they have struggled, to send their children to college. This was something Gary was talking about. Whereas the families who own land in Tillery have had much more success, educating their children, in spite of all the obstacles that they've faced. So, it's not perfect at all, but it's made a huge, enormous difference. And I mean, you would see that if you went there and you spent time with them. So I do want to kind of I want to push back against the idea that this kind of thing necessarily has failed, It failed in many ways, but it was not a complete, total failure. And I don't think that would be a reason to abandon it.
Yeah, let me just second that, because I've spent a lot of time in Tillery. So when you go to Tillery and you go to their Tuesday meetings, they jokingly identify themselves. Are you old Tillery? Like, are you the sharecropping part? Or are you the new Tillery? And they kind of laugh. But it was the new Tillery people. I think it was Gary's mother, who was the first African American in Halifax County to register to vote. Right. And that had spillover effects to old and new Tillery. And so there are many, I totally agree with you that you kind of, you can recognize the historic discrimination, but that doesn't mean that there weren't positive benefits. That means there could have been even more benefits if it had been operationalized in a just and fair way that wasn't racist.
Should we get multiple questions?
So yeah, so we have time for one more question.
I saw this gentleman down here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the presentations. I fully agree with our hypothesis that there has been a significant land loss of African American farmers, but one of the things I hope to see in the future analysis is a comparison with white land loss, in particular because of the consolidation within agriculture. And so how are you all thinking about controlling for that factor in addition to the discriminatory policies? And the second part of that is what will happen, or how will you manage the issue around heirs property, because the ownership of that property is fractionized and therefore not really, while they may show someone is African American and owns the property, it won't really show up clearly in the data. So how are you all going to manage that in the analysis?
I'll talk about the heirs property after you talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue of consolidation is an important one. I think, small white farmers have also struggled, under the new, they struggled at the time. It's hard to generalize, but, in relative to the wealthy landowners, like, it was not a great life either, for many white farmers. But there's not really a comparison, I think, in the way they experience their day-to-day life, and that there was much more mobility for white farmers. For instance, they could go into, at least conceivably, go into other industries and earn more money. They had political representation, and they didn't live under the threat of violence in the same way. I think that one way we've tried to somewhat sidestep this for the moment is by focusing on the shift in the distribution of land, and talking about how much land black families owned in 1910, and being somewhat agnostic about how they lost it or why it shifted, and talking mainly about how things could be different if the distribution did not change so much. And I think the agricultural system is fundamentally unjust. So smaller producers are also facing injustice, but I think because of the special difficulties that black farmers face, that it makes sense for this particular project. But I think it would be good for people to also look into the struggles that small white farmers had as well.
So I'll just talk in terms of some of the methodological challenges in terms of heirs property. It is oftentimes difficult to quantify, to study. There are two sets of researchers now who are trying to actually quantify the amount of heirs property ownership in the South. One is doing it without taking account of race, just overall heirs property. And that initiative is being led by the United States Forest Service's Southern Research Station, which is based in Athens, Georgia. There's a woman, Cassandra Johnson Gaither, who's one of the lead researchers on that. So they're using things like core logic and some other kind of estimating techniques. There's a emeritus professor at Auburn, Connor Bailey, and he's leading a different initiative to specifically try to estimate heirs property, African American heirs property ownership in the southern states. So the way I look at this is, at least in my work, and I do try to have humility about my work in terms of the broader trends and data and facts that we've heard here, which are overwhelmingly depressing, right? But when I started, the received wisdom was that black landowners inevitably were destined to become extinct by now, like by 2019, that there was no hope
for any legal reform or policy development to benefit them, because some folks wrote, and these are some law professors, I'm not going to call them out by name, that though unjust, African Americans simply were destined to be victims of racial injustice, no matter how sad that was, and there's nothing we can do about it, right? So I've tried to push in my work back against that notion, and one of the things, so for example, one of these narratives I often see is that folks cite the agricultural census data and say, oh, they're about extinct, right? Which then feeds this narrative that, well, it's too late. And the best we can do, and actually Juan Williams wrote a book that was well-intended several years ago that said, they're about to be extinct. What we need to do is write the histories of the last few black farmers so that for posterity's sake, 100 years now when there's none, that we will have the historical record, right? And I just fundamentally disagree with that, right? But part of it is we need better data. You need, like this 1999 USDA study that tried to account for agricultural ownership in a much more robust way, recognizing that there's a lot of African American families whose land is now lying fallow, partially because of discrimination and lack of access to these programs, or they're renting out. We need that data if you're going to do a more fine-grained kind of policy development or legal reform. You got to know what you're doing. You got to know what the data is. You got to look at trends. So one of the things that I've been trying to advocate for, once again, the Farm Bill includes a provision that's supposed to basically do studies like the 1999, but unfortunately the USDA has not followed through yet. Now the Farm Bill requires them to do these studies, so we're just going to have to try to hold them to account to do what the law says they must do. But that said, doesn't seem to be a constraint on their behavior in the past, but,
Right, so to piggyback on Thomas, the notion that they would be extinct is, I think, all part of a broader narrative, and I think a lot of people, well-meaning, are guilty of it also, that somehow this is all natural, that there's an evolution to it and this is what will take place, and it ignores the role of politics and political economy, and this is the result of choices we made, and likewise we can make a different set of choices, and none of this is inevitable. I think that's a key part of the framing, and I think it relates back to the other question that was asked about Pigsford case in the context of reparations. I think we focus too much on the economics of reparations without giving enough importance to the politics of reparations. The economics are critical, but the politics of it are important as well. So the politics of, you can't do this piecemeal. And this is my fear when linking things like cannabis reform to reparations, that this can't be done on the cheap. Because another part of, like we mentioned, 3 parts of reparations. The acknowledgement part and the whole truth and reconciliation is a critical component to achieve not only the redress, but the final phase, which is that we move on. If the goal is really to address our original sin of slavery and all the other discriminatory policies that our state has been involved in, then the move on part can't be done on the cheap. That I think is a critical thing, that not that black people have to give up all prospective claims of racism that might occur. We will need a system in place to ensure economic justice going forward, but if we want to address race for all the reasons we've been talking about, the politics are critical as well. And the last thing I'll say is, even if thinking about the other question about consolidation of farms and everything like that, we could achieve racial justice in terms of the wealth gap by creating a class of black billionaires, but that's not economic justice, and we can have another form of racial justice where we have a better distribution period, and that across that distribution, you have similarly situated whites and similarly situated blacks, but not one that's dysfunctional where you have one class of people, black or white, that controls either all the agricultural land or all the wealth in the country.
And just one more point, my co-author Nate reminded me of. I think I had forgotten to say this back to the first question that, and I think there are studies to back this up, that small white farmers are much more likely to be compensated for their land, and that their decision to sell was probably more volitional than most black families. And they definitely did not deal with the terror. For instance, I mentioned this book I'm about halfway through that he goes through dozens of different towns where there was a lynching, and the black families were terrified, and they left, and white families ended up obtaining their land. And I just don't think white farmers went through that.
Okay, I can't. If you're going to make that point, let me just make this last point. This is very similar to our narratives about eminent domain. So I don't know, we have, how many law students or lawyers do we have? Right, so in law, the picture of eminent domain is the city of New London, Kelo versus city of New London. So it's a white woman, right, in the city of New London who had her property condemned. And that has become the face of eminent domain abuse in the United States in our history, which takes no count of the fact that the majority of people who have lost their property as a result of eminent domain are people of color. People of color who were paid pennies on the dollar for their properties. Suzette Kelo, she might have a right to feel upset about having her property condemned. But what she can't say was that she was not treated economically justly. She was paid more than 2 times the fair market value of her property and given all kinds of other governmental assistance that black property owners who've had their property taken by eminent domain never received. So it's highly ironic that she has become the face of eminent domain abuse. Sorry, I got a little bit of a thing about that case.
That was worth saying.
Okay, thank you. So this ends the formal portion of the evening. But please hang around, get some food, and chat some more.